The speaker at this chapel service, Dr. Alister McGrath, is a towering British evangelical scholar and author. He is in Wheaton this week for a book launch of his newly released biography of C.S. Lewis, published by Tyndall House Publishers. Dr. McGrath did a small part of his research for this biography at the Marion E. Wade Center on Wheaton's campus, a library and museum that have the world's most complete collection of materials on C.S. Lewis. Immediately following this chapel service, Dr. McGrath will be at the Wade Center for a book signing session. I first saw Dr. McGrath on a Wheaton in England trip in the late 70s. I was milling about after a church service at St. Andrew's Church when a guest to the church, probably American, kept exclaiming to his wife about how unbelievable it was that, quote, "There's Alister McGrath just talking to people after church." In the summer of 1995, Dr. McGrath became a family hero to the Wheaton family, and again, the setting of the occasion was Oxford, England. On the day in question, I was teaching my Wheaton College class, and just as I was hitting my stride, as I recall it, there was a knock at the door, and the door opened. There stood my son in full academic regalia. It was such a shock to my system that I felt as though I was looking at a ghost. But this was a happy ghost, because he had just passed his viva. What's a viva? It's related to the Latin infinitive meaning to live, and the Italian verb meaning may he live. In a cute bit of gallows humor, European universities call an oral defense of a dissertation a viva. Philip was standing before me to inform me that his life had just been spared by 2 oral examiners, one of whom was Alister McGrath. In my professional life, Dr. McGrath has been a heroic figure and an inspiration to me in his role as a publishing scholar. And when I wrote a book on the King James Bible, Dr. McGrath's book on that same subject became part of my personal library of great books dear to my heart. Dr. McGrath spoke at Wheaton in 2011 at a conference on the King James Bible, and he also spoke in chapel. As the contact person on that occasion, I could not miss the affection that Dr. McGrath has for Wheaton College students. So in chapel this morning, we have a man of God with a soft spot in his heart for Wheaton students speaking about C.S. Lewis. My intuitions tell me it doesn't get better than that. Please extend the archetypal warm Wheaton welcome to Dr. Alister McGrath.
Well, thank you for that very kind welcome, and my apologies for the change in accent. It's always a joy to be here at Wheaton, and I want to talk to you about C.S. Lewis, or more accurately, I want to talk about the role God has given to C.S. Lewis in encouraging people like me, and I hope you as well. When I became a Christian in 1971, I gave up on atheism and embraced Christianity. And as I began to think things through, I found there were an awful lot of questions that I had to engage with. I needed answers to some of my questions. And about 2 or 3 years later, someone said to me, "You should read C.S. Lewis. He began as an atheist, ended up as a Christian. Maybe he's written something that might help you." So I went out and I bought 2 books by C.S. Lewis. Now, in those days, I was very, very poor, so buying books was a big deal, so I wrote my name and the date of purchase on those books, and they're still in my little library. And I read them, and I have to say, he spoke to me. He reassured me. Christianity makes sense. He helped me begin to understand things. He became my journeying companion as I began to explore the Christian faith. And sure, there were others who helped me in my walk of faith, as I'm sure there are others who help you as well. But the funny thing is, I still journey with C.S. Lewis today, and I find he helps me in ways that continue to excite me and continue to amaze me. What I want to do, if I may, is just talk about some of the ways in which he can help all of us as we try to go deeper in our faith, as we try to reach out to those around us, and try also to work out what we're meant to do with our lives. It seems to me that one of Lewis's great contributions is his emphatic assurance Christianity does indeed make sense. He asks us to see the Christian faith as giving us a big picture. We don't just focus on its fine detail, this idea, that idea. Rather, we stand back and we see the full picture, and we rejoice that the Christian faith is so comprehensive, so all-embracing. It's like standing back. Instead of looking at the brush strokes on a painting in the gallery, you stand back and take the whole thing in, and then you look at the brush strokes. Lewis lets us see the panorama of faith, and then we start looking at individual snapshots. The quotation from C.S. Lewis that I keep repeating, partly because it's so elegantly written, and partly because it is so good in terms of what it's trying to express, is this. It comes at the end of an essay on Is Theology Poetry? And he wrote this in the early 1940s. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not just because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And what Lewis is offering us there is not something invented, but something discovered. It's Lewis's realization of the intellectual capaciousness of the Christian faith. It's able to fit things in, what we see in the world around us, what we experience within us, what we see in culture, in history, in the sciences. The Christian faith is not about a God of the gaps, focusing on things we can't explain, but rather giving us this big picture which helps us understand why we can explain anything at all. And I tried to take that in, and it hurt my head at points. But I'm going to tell you that Lewis really reassured me, and he challenged me. He challenged me as to whether I'd really grasped this properly and taken it in. And Lewis became someone who at one and the same time encouraged me and reassured me. And we all need that. But also one who asked me whether really I had gone far enough in my understanding of faith. So in many ways, I'm commending Lewis to you, not to displace others around you who are already talking to you about your faith, who are trying to help you to go deeper and go further, but rather as a traveling companion along this road of faith. He's been there before you. He's able to help you in so many ways. So what sort of things does Lewis help us with? Well, if I may, I'm just going to single out a number of them, ones that I found helpful, in the hope that you will find them helpful as well. That quotation I gave you from Lewis says, in effect, that there is a landscape of faith, and some of it is in darkness. There are shadowlands, things we don't fully understand. Suffering is one of them. Yet, the gospel lights this up. It makes things clearer than they otherwise might be. And maybe it doesn't dispel all the shadows, but it allows us to see enough to know that we can keep going and keep growing as we journey with this gracious God who cares for each of us so much. And I value that. Lewis himself knew about these shadowlands. You all know the story of Joy Davidman, who Lewis married late in life, who developed cancer. And Lewis is wrestling with the question, where is God in all of this? And his final conclusion, I look at Jesus Christ suffering on the cross, and he is bearing pain for us. And that for Lewis was enough to keep him going. But I think Lewis speaks to us in many ways, and that's why I think he bounced back after his death. Lewis, I think you all know, died in 1963. He died on the same day as John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. And people felt Lewis was going to fade away. He'd served a previous generation well. Now there was a new generation rising with different agendas, different concerns. Lewis was seen by many as a voice from the past. But in the 1980s and beyond, people began to rediscover Lewis. He seemed to speak to them. He seemed to give them a vision of their faith. He seemed to help them go deeper in ways that surprised them. First of all, Lewis reminded us of the importance of stories. Not just understanding Christian ideas, though Lewis says those are very important, but rather being able not simply to engage the mind, but also the imagination. For Lewis, it was important not simply to show that Christianity is right, but it has a capacity to captivate the imaginations of each of us and of our culture as well. And Lewis grasped the importance of stories. Many of you will have read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and you will know that when the children enter this strange world of Narnia, they hear stories. One story is, this is the realm of the White Witch, and she is its lawful queen. But there is another story that was really the realm of this mysterious Aslan, and the White Queen is really a usurper. And they have to make up their minds which story is right, which story shall they trust, because they're clearly not both right. And Lewis, I think, helps us there as we wrestle with the question of what story we trust. Is this world just a random event? Are we just random outcomes of a blind process? That's a story that many tell today. But there is another story, and the other story is that each of us is the child of a living and loving God. It's a story of creation, fall, redemption, and consummation, and it's a story which gives each of us an assurance that in some way our little story connects up with this bigger story, that in effect each of us here today has a story of our own, which is not an independent story, but is part of this greater story of God. And one of the challenges each of us has is to try and work out how we fit into this greater scheme of things, what God is calling us to do in this story which is ongoing and of which you and I are part. And Lewis is simply saying, there is this, we might say, a meta-narrative, a grand story, a big story, which is all about God and his purposes, and each of us is part of that story. And I find that to be a privilege and a challenge. It's wonderful to be part of that story. It's a challenge to work out what we're meant to be doing and then to get on with that. But in focusing on Christianity telling a story, Lewis is reminding us that we are able to tell a story which challenges the dominant narratives of our culture and which brings each of us identity, purpose, and value. And that seems to me to be an enormously important thing to say, especially for any of you who feel you are overwhelmed, that you don't really matter. This story asks you to rethink that and recalibrate just how much you matter in the greater place of things. But Lewis is more than just someone who is a master storyteller, who helps us realize that the Christian story is both imaginatively exciting and intellectually illuminating. He's also someone who realized that we cannot simply rest content with being Christians. We need to be able to reach out to those beyond the Christian faith and explain to them winsomely, attractively, persuasively what the Christian faith is all about. And today, many of us remember C.S. Lewis as one of the best apologists there has been. And I think he encourages all of us to think about this. How might we try and commend and explain our faith to our family, to our friends, to those around us? And Lewis has a great emphasis on the importance of what he calls translation. Translation. Lewis learnt the importance of this the hard way. In the Second World War, Lewis went round to talk at Air Force bases on what Christianity was all about. And he did it in his rather academic, donnish way, and it got nowhere. And he began to realize he was going to have to learn the language of ordinary people if he was going to be able to explain what Christianity was all about and lodge it in the realities of their lives. It was hard, but he did it. And that's one of the reasons why his broadcast talks in England were so successful. And you'll find those in his book, Mere Christianity. But Lewis learned a lesson he asks all of us to learn in turn. Namely, how do we translate the realities of the gospel into language that's going to connect up with the people that we meet in our everyday lives? Next Friday is Good Friday, and then we think very intensely about the meaning of the death of Christ. And we're going to use words like atonement, redemption, a whole series of words like salvation, which mean a lot to us. And sometimes, I suppose, we just think that because they mean a lot to us, their meaning is automatically obvious to anybody we talk to. Lewis says, don't make that mistake. He writes, we must learn the language of our audience. And we can't lay down in advance what the ordinary person thinks. We've got to learn it by listening to them. We've got to be able to translate our words into words that they can understand. And so maybe next Friday, when you're thinking about all that Christ's death on the cross means, you might do what C.S. Lewis would encourage you to do. Work out how, if you were talking to a friend who's not a Christian, you might try and put into words the wonder, the amazement of all that Christ has done for us. I regularly try and do this. It's a good challenge, and one I think that you can benefit from as well. But Lewis, as you probably know, began at Oxford University, and in 1955 he moved to Cambridge. And Lewis saw that as marking a new phase in his life. In Oxford, he engaged head-on with the critics of Christianity. In Cambridge, he felt he wanted to do things rather differently. And it's from that Cambridge period that some of his finest writings aimed for Christians begin to emerge. Lewis talked about how he found doing apologetics to be personally exhausting. He needed to be almost refreshed in order to do this again. And so in his later career, he began to write books aimed at refreshing, encouraging Christians. Books like Reflections on the Psalms, The Four Loves. And these late books are about Lewis trying to help Christians go deeper into their faith, to give them refreshment, that they might in effect drink deeply of these waters and find themselves both encouraged and resourced as they live the Christian life, and also, of course, try to explain this to their friends. So I find Lewis a great challenge because of what he did, because of what he wrote. But this chapel service is not about Lewis. It's about celebrating all that God is and all that God does through Christ in us and for us. And therefore, I want, if I may, in this final part of the talk, simply to highlight one or two points that Lewis, I think, helps us to grasp about God himself. I mentioned earlier, Lewis began as an atheist. And if you read his letters as a young man to his best friends, you will sense the anger he feels against God. He is not simply an indifferent atheist, he is an angry atheist. Rather, in his own day, like Richard Dawkins, who in effect rants against God. How dare God allow suffering in this world? It's a very important point, because today we don't remember Lewis as an atheist at all. We remember him as a Christian writer, and above all as an able and winsome defender of the Christian faith. And the key to all of this lies in conversion, in the momentous event which may have taken place in 1929 or 1930, in which God turned Lewis around. He spoke of himself as being the most reluctant convert in all England, but he was a convert. And he began to grow in his faith, and because he'd been an atheist, he knew where others were and what could be said to them to help them make that transition too. I'm one who's been helped by Lewis. There are countless others. But the point I want to make is that Lewis is a trophy of God's grace. He's a reminder that there are many angry young men and women who rant against God and yet remarkably find themselves turned around by divine grace, by an encounter with God which changes everything. And that, I think, is one of the most important things about Lewis. Yes, he wrote some wonderful things, and as you journey in your faith, you may well find him a traveling companion who helps you, who encourages you, who helps you to move on in the Christian life. But let's zoom back and look at the greater picture, which is that of a God who calls people to serve him and to do great things in them and great things through them. Lewis is a witness to the power, to the compassion, to the love of a God who meets people on the road of life, as he met Saul on the road to Damascus, as he met C.S. Lewis, even me, and I'm sure many others in this audience as well. Lewis speaks to us as one who realized God was not simply an idea, but a living reality who turned lives around and transformed them. So as I close, let me simply make one point. I hope all of you will grow in your Christian lives as you think things through, as you work out what God wants you to do, as you reach out into the future. And to do that, we need friends. And you have friends around you, but you also need others who can help you think things through, who will reassure you as you try to make sense of your faith and give you that sense of confidence in the right sense of the word about the Christian faith. Lewis is someone I have journeyed with now for nearly 40 years. And I want to say to you, he is a good traveling companion. But my final point is this. Lewis is good, and I'm so glad he's there. But we need other people like him. We need others who are able to engage our culture. We need others who are able to reassure Christians. We need others who are able to challenge the dominant narratives of our culture. And I believe in this distinguished audience this morning, there are some who God wants to do exactly that. I want to plant that seed and just see where it goes. It needs to be done, and by God's grace, it's going to be done. And I think there are some here this morning who will be able to do it. So whether you are the next C.S. Lewis, or whether you're just a good Christian who wants to give your best for God in this world, then I just pray God's richest blessing on all you do here at Wheaton and on wherever you go in the future. I just pray that this rich God who loves each of us so much will open your eyes about where he wants you to be, but above all will journey with you, always by your side, wherever he takes you in the future. Thank you so much for listening.